He thought his twin daughters were gone forever, lost to a world he couldn't reach. But 3 years later, on a cold winter's day, he found them singing on a bus, alive and unaware of the storm waiting to break. What he didn't know yet was that this reunion would shatter not just his heart, but his entire life before it could even begin. Where are you watching this from? Let us know down in the comments. If stories like this move you, don't forget to subscribe and join our family. Now, settle in. The story starts now. The snow didn't speak back when I cursed it. It only pressed harder against my boots, soaking through the cracks I hadn't bothered to mend. My breath came in clouds that seemed to vanish faster than I could feel them. Everything out there was white and gray and quiet, the kind of quiet that makes a man feel erased. I wasn't supposed to be on that road. Hadn't ridden it since Marion died. But the old mare kept pulling east, like some thread I couldn't see had caught her bridle and was tugging from the horizon. I let her. After all, when a man's alone, most choices stop feeling like choices. They feel like surrender. I passed the old mill stump, the one with the axe head still buried in it, rusted and forgotten. The wind screamed through the pines up there. Cold, mean, and sharp enough to take skin if you let it. And then I saw them. Not right away. At first I thought it was debris from a broken wagon, or maybe sacks of grain split in the snow. But when the mare sidestepped and whinnied low, I looked again. 3 mounds, small. Still? Too still. I dismounted slow, hand on my coat pocket where the matches were. You never know, out there. I'd seen wolves do worse than hunger. I'd seen men do worse than wolves. The smallest of the 3 was trembling, but only just. You could miss it if the wind caught your eyes wrong. They were all seated against the remains of a burnt-out sled. Blackened wood, half wheels sunk in snow like ancient bones. And over their heads sacks. Tight. Not to shield them from snow, but to silence them. I didn't move fast. The air around them was too fragile, like it would shatter if I breathed wrong. My fingers touched the edge of the burlap on the tallest one first. Underneath, I saw red cheeks, cracked lips, and eyes that weren't afraid, just tired. I didn't ask who did it. Didn't matter. Not then. I pulled the sacks one by one. Found 3 little faces bruised by cold, not yet by time, no tears, no begging, just quiet. The kind of quiet you find in places where hope got buried too early. I didn't say much. I wrapped them in my coat, one at a time. The littlest leaned into my chest like it was something she'd done before. Like hiding in the arms of a stranger was safer than anything she knew. We didn't ride fast. The snow was too deep. The mare knew the way back to my cabin better than I did. Every step she took, I felt the weight shift behind me, 3 bundles of life that shouldn't have been left to die in the open like dogs. Less than dogs. Dogs bark. No one tied sacks over their heads. The cabin stood at the edge of the pines like a secret waiting to be forgotten. I hadn't lit the stove that morning, hadn't planned on coming back. But the girls were shaking now, even under the coat. The eldest was biting her lip hard enough to draw blood. I opened the door with one hand, kicked it wider with my boot, and carried them in like broken prayers. One by one, set them near the stove, laid blankets down. Wood, match, flame. The fire caught like it had been waiting. They didn't speak. Not then. Not that night. I found some old bread, soaked it in what milk I had left, set out 3 chipped bowls, watched as the eldest nudged the other 2 forward. She didn't eat herself until they did. I sat near the fire, not close, not far, just enough for the warmth to reach all of us. There were no names exchanged, no questions asked. But in that silence, something began to settle. Not comfort, not yet, but the shape of it. By nightfall, the littlest had fallen asleep, curled in the corner, thumb in mouth. A wooden spoon she'd pulled from under the cot clutched in her hand like a sword. I didn't sleep much, not because I feared someone would come, but because the air in the cabin had changed. It carried something now, not just smoke and ash, but memory, and something else. Possibility. The snow kept falling, soft as ash, but colder than death. It wrapped around us like silence, coating the ground, the trees, the twisted wagon skeleton behind us, the last remnants of what had once been a family's life, burnt out and left to rot. I didn't speak for the first hour. Neither did the children. 6 of them. All silent. All staring, some with eyes that didn't blink much anymore. The oldest girl, maybe 12 or 13, kept her arms tightly around the smallest one, a boy with a crooked leg who hadn't spoken a word since I found them. I didn't ask their names. Not yet. They weren't ready to give them, and I wasn't ready to deserve them. I kept us moving north, toward the tree line, away from the old trail, away from the blood. The mare's breath steamed in the air, rhythmic and patient. She knew better than I did how far we could go in this weather, but I pushed her gently. We needed to be gone by dawn. Someone would come looking. Not for them, no. For whoever took them. It was only once we reached the ridgeline that I stopped and looked back. The horizon behind us glowed orange under the moonlight fire, not dawn. Smoke from a scout's torch maybe, or worse, a burning cabin, lit as a warning. I set my jaw and kept moving. There was no turning back. We found shelter under a rock outcrop near the high pines, a little hollow where the wind didn't bite so deep. I laid the blankets down and gave the children what little dried meat I had. They ate it slow, with small bites, like they didn't want to be noticed by the night. I built a fire from pine and birch bark. It snapped loud in the stillness, and one of the boys flinched. His knuckles were raw. The back of his shirt was torn and stained dark, not with snowmelt, but something older. He didn't ask. They'd been through enough. Whatever happened to their parents, they hadn't told me, and I wasn't about to make them relive it before they were ready. But I knew the signs. I'd seen the scars before at Shiloh, at Andersonville, in the eyes of the broken men who came back from both. I wasn't a soldier anymore. Not really, but I hadn't forgotten how to fight. They slept in a pile that night, like a litter of fox pups all curled into each other, sharing one warmth. I sat with my back to the fire, rifle in hand, watching the tree line for movement. Around midnight, I heard something in the dark, maybe an owl. Maybe not. He didn't sleep. By the second day, the youngest girl began to speak. Just a little, soft words in her own tongue, mostly to her sister. I caught only pieces. I'd picked up some of their language years ago, enough to trade, enough to listen, but it had been a long time. I nodded when she spoke, didn't interrupt. That night, while they ate boiled snow and old beans, the oldest girl finally looked me in the eye and said in English, "You gonna sell us?" I stared at her. "No," I said. "Not now. Not ever." She held the look a moment longer, then turned her face to the fire. "They always do," she whispered. Something cracked in me then, quietly, like old wood under weight. I didn't ask what she meant. I already knew. 3 days into the mountains, the trail vanished beneath new snow. We took to the river instead, slow, cold, dangerous, but harder to track. I carried the boy with the crooked leg across the ice in my arms. He clung to me tight, breathing shallow, like even that closeness hurt. At night, I stitched their torn clothes, cooked what little I could catch, and tried not to let the fear show in my face. It wasn't just the soldiers I was worried about now. There were bounty men, too, the kind who got paid by the scalp or by the sack. Some didn't care who they dragged back. Native or not, if you were brown-skinned and breathing, you had a price. And these children, they weren't just runaways. They were survivors of something worse, something deliberate. On the 5th day, I found boot prints near the river bend. Not mine, not the children's. Fresh ones, wide-spaced, heavy tread, more than one set. I didn't tell the kids. I just picked up the pace. By then, I'd learned their names. The oldest girl was Awanita, which meant fawn in her language. She'd taken on the role of mother, nurse, and shield for the other 5. She had old eyes too old for 13. The boy with the twisted leg was Chenoa Dove. He didn't speak much, but when he did, his voice was soft and even, like still water. The others were younger: Dakota, Waya, Aylin, and Sahel. each with stories behind their names I hadn't yet heard, each carrying more than a child should. Names have power. That's what my grandmother used to say. So I began to use them. We crossed into Dakota territory on the 7th day. There was an old cabin, I remembered, tucked in the hills near an abandoned mine. It had belonged to a trapper I once knew, a quiet man who died with no kin and no debts. I'd buried him myself years ago, left the place untouched. We stayed there. The roof leaked and the walls were thin, but it was ours. For now, I fixed the fire pit, patched the windows with hide, laid snares by the creek, and took the oldest boy, Waya, with me to learn the trail signs. He was smarter than most grown men I knew, had the kind of memory that trapped every bird call, every snap twig, every shadow. We didn't talk much, but I could feel it building trust, like sap rising in spring. One night, as the snow thickened again and the fire cracked warm, Awanita sat beside me and asked, "Why are you helping us?" Her voice wasn't accusing anymore, just tired. I didn't answer right away. "I saw too many people look away," I said finally. Figured it was time someone didn't. She watched me for a long moment, then nodded. Not like a child, like someone who'd already buried her childhood and moved past it. The calm didn't last. On the 10th day, Waya spotted smoke on the ridge. Too far for a campfire, too still for brush fire. Someone was watching, maybe tracking. I readied the rifle, cleaned my knife, and started planning a second route deeper into the forest, where the map grew thin and the law grew quiet. We couldn't stay. We couldn't fight. Not yet. But I made a vow that night, same as a prayer. I would not let them be taken. Not by soldiers. Not by bounty men. Not by any man who called this justice. They'd known too much of this country's cruelty. They'd earned a chance at mercy. The moon was our only lantern, soft and white above the pines. I'd let the children sleep until midnight, knowing we couldn't stay in the hollow any longer. The fire left behind no smoke, no glow. We moved like ghosts through the snow. I led the mare by her reins. Her breath came in slow clouds. Two of the younger ones, Mika and little Wana, clung to her flanks for warmth, barely walking, barely awake. Behind them, Ilu held Ado on her back, the boy still fevered and weak, his head rolling against her shoulder. She hadn't said a word all night, just kept walking, one step after the other, like her silence might hold the whole group together. The land changed as we moved northward. Hills gentled out, the trees thinned, cold seeped deeper, not the kind that cut, but the kind that numbed. I knew the country well enough old fur trapping routes, long forgotten cabins left to rot, but with each passing hour, I could feel the noose tightening. Someone would come. That officer I left face down in the snow would have told someone before we ever got there. They wouldn't just lose 6 children like that. We stayed off main trails. The kids were good about moving quiet. They'd learned young, too young, what it meant to disappear into trees. They knew not to cry out. Even the baby girl, Suni, who I'd swaddled in my old coat and carried across my chest, barely made a sound. Every hour we walked, their steps slowed. By dawn, I found us a place to rest, a half-buried log shelter beside a frozen creek. Looked like some trapper's lean-to from 20 years back. Roof sagging, moss gone, but it held out the wind. I started a fire with dry pine needles and broken twigs, hidden low behind a rock wall I built by hand. While the flames caught, the children fell where they stood, curling up like wild things, all bone and blanket and silence. Ilu didn't sleep. She sat across from me, holding a stick in the fire, watching it blacken. "You lied," she said. Her voice was like flint-quiet, sharp and deliberate. I didn't say anything right away. Just let her words hang there between us, catching in the wood smoke. "You said you were taking us to our families," she added. I glanced at the others. They were asleep, bundled close, legs tangled, arms tucked in. Even Wana's hand clutched at Ato's shirt like she was afraid he'd vanish if she let go. "He said he'd keep you safe," I replied. He didn't promise a reunion. She turned her face toward the firelight, and for the first time I saw just how old she was becoming, not in years, but in weight, and how much she'd carried. "There's no one left," she said flat. "The soldiers took them. The ones they didn't take, they shot. There is no tribe to return to." My throat tightened. I hadn't asked where they came from. I hadn't asked because I didn't want to know. Because pretending we were heading somewhere gave them hope. And hope, even false, was enough to keep small legs moving. "How do you know?" I asked. "I saw it." She looked me in the eye then, and I saw in her the same fire I'd once carried as a boyrage banked by sorrow, embers of something long burned down. She didn't cry. She didn't have to. "I'm sorry," I said. "Don't be," she whispered. "Just don't lie anymore." We stayed in the lean-to that day. I boiled snow for water, broke up old roots for tea, fed them dry biscuits and jerky from my satchel. It wasn't enough, wouldn't be enough. By nightfall, I'd made a decision. I needed help. Real help. Supplies. A map to cross the mountain passes before full winter made it impossible. There was a town 2 days' ride east Tarn's Crossing. I hadn't been there in years, but I knew a man, Enoch Breyer. He owed me, though he'd deny it. But I'd saved his life once during a cattle raid gone wrong, and men don't forget debts like that. Or shouldn't. I didn't like leaving the children alone, but I couldn't take them into town. Not where questions might be asked. "Elu," I said as I packed my saddlebag, "you'll keep watch." She nodded without hesitation. "You have this," I added, handing her my revolver. "One shot in the chamber. You won't need more than that. If someone comes, don't try to fight, hide." She weighed it in her hand, looked up at me once, and said, "Come back." That was all. I rode hard through the night. The mare was near spent by dawn, and my fingers ached from cold, but I reached Tarn's Crossing by midday. Smoke rose from chimneys. Snow melted in dark rivulets beneath wagon wheels. It looked the same, like a painting left untouched on a wall, but I'd changed too much to feel welcome. I didn't head straight for Enoch. First, I went to the general store, bought flour, beans, a jar of molasses, matches, a new blanket, then a pair of children's boots when I saw how threadbare Juana's had been. "Early for winter gear," the shopkeeper said. "You got kids?" "Something like that," I muttered, paying cash. I found Enoch behind the saloon, throwing horse dung into a cart. "Didn't expect to see your face again," he grunted without turning. "I need a favor," I said. He stopped, wiped his hands on a dirty rag, and looked at me. His beard had gone gray. His eyes hadn't. "Someone idea?" he asked. "Not yet," I said. "But they will, if I don't get them out of here." He squinted. "Children?" I nodded. "Indian?" Again I nodded. He spat. "Not in disgust. Just habit." "Christ, Bell," he said. "What have you done?" "Something right," I said. "For once." He studied me for a long time. Then he walked to his barn and returned with an old map, oil slick and worn. He pointed with a thick finger. "Here's your pass," he said. "Old fur route. Dangerous. But no patrols." "Thank you," I said. He caught my arm before I left. "This won't go unpunished," he warned. "Not these days. You understand that?" "I do," I said. "But I'd rather be hunted for doing good than sleep warm knowing I did nothing." I rode back with full bags, numb hands, and a plan. We'd take the mountain path within 2 nights, cross before snow sealed it shut. Beyond that refuge. Maybe in Canada. Maybe somewhere without wires and forts and chains. When I reached the shelter, Elu was standing guard. Fire low, children safe. I handed her the boots. She didn't smile, but her eyes softened. "We leave soon," I said. She nodded. "I'll tell the others." As they gathered their few things, I looked at each of them, tired, worn, but alive. And something stirred in me then. Something I hadn't felt in years. Purpose. Maybe this wasn't redemption, maybe there was no such thing, but it was the right path. And I would walk it until the end. I could hear the river long before I saw it. A low, continuous murmur in the stillness, like a giant breathing somewhere beneath the trees. It wasn't loud, but steady and alive, the kind of sound that rooted itself in your bones and stayed there. It reminded me of something ancient, something that had watched the world burn and rebuild again and again, unchanged. The children were quiet as we moved, too quiet for their age. No whimpering, no idle chatter, only the occasional glance passed between them like birds signaling in a storm. I knew it wasn't fear that kept them silent, not anymore. It was something else, a learned caution. The kind that grows from knowing the world isn't kind to your kind. The trail leading to the river was a deer path, barely there. Brush scraped at our legs, brambles tugged at the hem of my coat, but we kept moving. I carried the smallest boy for part of the way. He was trembling from fever, his skin hot against my arm. His weight didn't bother me. What bothered me was the thought that there might not be enough time. By the time we reached the riverbank, dusk was crawling over the treetops. The sky above looked bruised, and the air smelled of pine and wet stone. I stopped beside a crooked cottonwood and let the children sit in the clearing. Across the water, a narrow gap in the hills marked the passage north. That's where we were headed. That's where freedom lived, or at least the illusion of it. I crouched by the river and touched the water. It was colder than I expected, fast and glassy. We'd have to cross. Tonight. The ferry route had long since fallen into disuse, ever since the army set up checkpoints farther downriver. I didn't trust bridges anymore. They drew too many eyes. But I remembered a spot, a shallow bend where the rocks formed a natural ford. If the water hadn't risen too much with the spring melt, it might still be passable. If not, we'd have to swim. I spent an hour scouring the banks, marking the current, judging the depth. The moon crept higher behind the clouds. I returned to find the children huddled together for warmth. One of the girls, the eldest, had gathered pine needles into a pile and placed the feverish boy on top like a nest. She looked up when I approached. There was no trust in her eyes, but there was something close to resolve. That night, we crossed the river. The youngest clung to my back as I moved into the current. The chill hit me like a slap, seizing my legs and chest, but I kept walking. The river pushed hard, and I leaned into it, guiding the others one by one. I couldn't tell if my shaking was from cold or fear. Halfway across, I slipped. My foot struck a loose stone, and I went under. The boy on my back screamed not out loud, but in the way a body tenses when it thinks death has come. I surfaced choking, dragging him up with me, coughing river into the night air. I don't remember getting to the other side, only the weight of wet clothes and the burn in my lungs. We collapsed beneath the trees, soaking and breathless. The fevered boy wouldn't stop shivering. I stripped him, wrapped him in my coat, and pressed him against me for warmth. We didn't light a fire. We couldn't afford the smoke. Sleep didn't come. Not truly. Only brief blinks into darkness, interrupted by dreams that weren't dreams, memories twisted by fear. Men on horseback. Screams. Firelight. I woke often, clutching the boy, listening for footsteps. But the forest stayed quiet. In the morning, the storm came. It started with wind. High in the branches, the pines began to whisper. Then the rain, cold and heavy. It fell like punishment, turning the dirt to soup and soaking what little we had. I built a lean-to from dead wood and tried to keep the children dry, but it was no use. Everything turned to mud. The fevered boy barely stirred. We moved again that afternoon, pushing farther north. The ground climbed and the trees thinned. I followed deer tracks, old ones, hoping they'd lead to higher, drier ground. The children walked without complaint, though I knew their feet must have been raw. I thought often about the men who would come. I knew they were looking for us, men with guns, men with orders. The kind who saw brown skin and thought, enemy. I had been one of them once, though I never pulled a trigger. Now I was a traitor, a ghost, a man marked by conscience. That night, we camped on a bluff overlooking the valley. The rain had stopped, but the wind had teeth. I started a fire, shielded by rocks and brush, just enough to keep us alive. While the others slept, I sat awake with my rifle across my knees and thought about the line I'd crossed. Once, I believed there was honor in following orders. That duty meant doing what you were told. But the older I got, the more I realized that some orders were written in blood, not ink. And some uniforms didn't make a man right, only dangerous. I had seen too much to pretend otherwise now. The fever broke just before dawn. The boy stirred, coughed, and finally opened his eyes. There was no smile, but his chest moved easier. I let out a breath I didn't know I'd been holding. One more night. One more ridge. Then the canyon. Then, maybe, safety. But hope is a dangerous thing when you're hunted. Around noon, I spotted smoke in the east. Thin, rising straight as scout fire. They were closer than I thought. We had half a day, maybe less. I didn't tell the children. I just packed our things, lifted the boy into my arms, and began to run. The days that followed our escape into the ravine passed in a hush. The wind carried less sound, the birds flew wider arcs above us, and even the water in the stream seemed to flow with more caution. I kept the children close, their fire-darkened faces flickering with the light of early autumn. They spoke little now, each learning silence as a shield. Fear was no longer something they ran from. It had curled around their ankles, climbed into their bones. It had become a companion. We moved at night, always. During the day, we buried ourselves in the green tangle of trees and stone. I taught them how to step where branches wouldn't snap, how to breathe through their noses in cold air, how to read the signs left behind by white men and native alike. Most of them learned quickly. I was particularly struck by the eldest girl, Sani. She watched everything my hands, the sky, the earth, like she meant to remember it all forever. That sort of attention isn't born of curiosity. It comes from loss. Each night we drifted further from the military line. But I knew it wasn't far enough. Not yet. One night, as frost crept onto the leaves around our camp, I left the children sleeping beneath the low rock overhang. I walked 2 miles upriver to scout the pass. The moon hung above like a blade, sharp and cold, and I could smell snow in the distance weeks early. The land was trying to warn us, I thought. Or maybe it was mourning something already lost. I reached the ridge and lay flat against the earth. From there, I could see the road that twisted through the canyon below. Smoke curled from a narrow column of wagons in the distance. U.S. cavalry. Maybe 2 days behind us. When I returned, Tahu was awake. His dark eyes caught mine, unblinking, and he asked the question he hadn't dared speak until then. Are they coming? I nodded once. Yes. Will we fight? No, I said. Not yet. He was quiet a long time. Then, you don't talk like a soldier, but you fight like one. I said nothing. There was nothing to say. I wasn't sure what I was anymore. I had worn their uniform. I had marched under their flag. I had fired into camps and ridden with smoke in my wake. But now I guarded children from those same men, from men who once called me brother. The next day we crossed into the Badlands. Sharp ridges rose like the spines of some ancient beast, and the ground split in cracked veins of red clay and dust. Water was scarcer here, and shade almost non-existent. But the land was cruel to horses and wagons. No cavalry would follow us through this maze. Or so I thought. We camped in a deep pocket of rock, the sun a low orange smear behind us. I gathered the children and drew a map in the dirt where we'd go, what they'd do if I didn't return, how to follow the crows and rivers if they had to move without me. They listened in silence, even the youngest, their faces brittle and still. I gave each of them a piece of jerky, the last from our stores, and sat beside Sani while she chewed. You're not staying with us, she said quietly. It wasn't a question. I looked at her, surprised by how much she saw. They'll catch our scent soon, I said. If I draw them off, you'll have more time. She looked down at the rock beneath her feet. They'll kill you, maybe. Her fingers clenched around the strip of meat. But you said no more dying. I forced a bitter smile. I meant no more dying for nothing. She didn't smile back. That night, I left them again. This time with a rifle slung across my back and a horse stolen from a settler's barn 2 days ago. I rode west toward the army slow at first, then faster once I knew they'd picked up our trail. I made no effort to hide. I left marks, overturned stones, kicked up dust with the horses' hooves. I made myself a ghost worth chasing. By dawn, they were near. I reached a small rise and waited. The air smelled of gun oil and leather. When the first scout broke the ridge, I fired once not to kill but to make myself seen. Then I ran. They followed. For a day and a half, I dragged them across the broken land. I led them in circles, toward cliffs, through dried riverbeds and thick gullies. I wanted them to sweat, to tire, to lose faith in their mission. I wanted them to forget the children. But soldiers don't forget orders. On the third morning, just as the frost began to melt off the sagebrush, they caught up. My horse gave out first. We tumbled down a slope together, the beast screaming. Its legs snapped beneath it. I rolled free, bruised and breathless, and scrambled for cover. Gunshots cracked behind me. I crawled into a ditch, clutching the rifle, hands trembling. I thought maybe I'd die there. But fate or something crueler had other plans. A voice barked above me. "Drop it!" When I didn't move, a boot stomped the rifle from my grip. I looked up and met the eyes of Captain James Rowe. I hadn't seen him in 3 years. He looked older, harder, but the disgust on his face was fresh, like the moment he recognized me had carved something out of him. "Bell," he spat. "You traitorous bastard." I said nothing. I had no words he'd believe. He kicked me once hard, then ordered the men to bind my hands. As they dragged me up, Rose circled me like a wolf that couldn't decide whether to bite or speak. "You'll tell me where the children are," he said low, "or I swear you'll hang from the first tree we find." I stared past him, blood dripping into one eye. "You've already taken their homes. You won't take them too." He hit me. Harder this time. But I didn't tell them. Not that day. Not the next. Even when they marched me toward a holding post 10 miles south, a place they called Fort Chase, I kept my mouth shut. My silence was the only shield I had left. The children were alone now, hidden in a land with teeth, and I could only pray that I'd bought them enough time. I lost track of time behind those cold iron bars. Days bled into nights with little more than the creak of the wooden floors and the distant howl of wolves to remind me that the world outside still breathed. They called it Fort Chase, but to me it might as well have been a graveyard. They fed me scraps and called it justice. They bound my hands and called it law. But my mind was somewhere else out there, with the children, Sani, Tahu, and little Mai, alone in the wilderness, fragile and raw like the first brittle frost of winter. I had been their shield, and now I was nothing but a ghost in a cage, my body aching, my spirit stretched thin. Captain Rowe visited often. Each time, his words dripped like venom. "Tell me where the children are." "I don't know," I said every time. The lie tasted bitter in my mouth, but it was the only one that kept me alive. He hated my silence more than any blow. "Bell," he spat one evening, shadows from the lantern casting flickering masks on his face. "You're a dead man's echo. You think you can save them? You're nothing." Maybe he was right. Maybe I was nothing. But I clung to that nothing because it was all I had left. The jail cell was a frozen tomb in winter's grip. Snow pressed against the thick walls, and the cold seeped into my bones like a slow poison. But worse than the cold was the silence, the long, suffocating quiet that settled like dust over every hope I had left. I thought about the girls constantly. I imagined their faces beneath those tattered cloaks, their breath visible in the morning air, their hands clutching each other in the dark. Were they safe? Had the wilderness swallowed them whole? Or were they walking into some trap I had not foreseen? The weight of it crushed me. One night, through the thin window, I saw the stars sharp and distant. I whispered a prayer, not for myself, but for them. Hold on, I thought. Hold on. The day came when the jail doors creaked open, and I was dragged before the sheriff's court. They said it was a hearing, a chance for me to speak, to explain myself. But it felt like a spectacle, a mockery of justice in a town that had forgotten what the word meant. The courtroom was small and crowded. Faces I didn't recognize filled the benches, some curious, some hostile, many indifferent. The judge sat high, an old man with tired eyes who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. I stood there, shackled and silent. My lawyer, a young man with hopeful eyes, tried to speak on my behalf, but his words were drowned in the murmurs of the crowd. Then the accusers arrived. A man with a scar running across his jaw stepped forward. His voice was cold and hard. "You're harboring fugitives," he said. "Children who belong to a family with claims to land and property. You took them from rightful owners and hid them away. That's theft. That's lawlessness." I wanted to shout at him, to tell him what those children had endured, the fires, the ropes, the cold nights alone. But I held back. Words would not save them here. The judge's hammer fell with a thud that echoed through my chest. "We will investigate the claims," he said. "Until then, the children are to remain in protective custody." Protective custody. The words twisted in my gut. That night, as I was escorted back to the cell, I thought of the girls huddled somewhere, maybe scared, maybe hoping I would come back. I had to find them. Meanwhile, the children left alone had become something else. Sonny, the eldest, took charge with a fierce determination. She had the look of someone who had borne the weight of loss too early, but beneath her stoic eyes was a heart that refused to break. She found shelter in an abandoned mining shack, half buried beneath a heap of stones and dust. The roof was cracked, the walls thin, but it was warmth enough to keep the cold at bay. Beneath the low beams, the three girls gathered around a small fire made from dry pine needles and twigs. Their faces were pale, eyes large and wary, but there was a strange sort of peace there, fragile, like a spiderweb kissed by dew. They ate quietly, each bite a small victory against the gnawing hunger and fear. Days passed without word from me. They counted on my return, on some miracle to pull them from the shadows. But miracles were hard to come by in a world built on greed and lies. Tahu, the middle child, spent hours tracing the lines of the land on scraps of bark, marking places where water flowed, where the trees grew thickest, where they might find safe passage. Mai, the youngest, clutched a wooden spoon, their only toy, their only reminder of the world before. Together, they dreamed of a place where they could run free, unafraid. Back in the town, whispers began to spread. Stories about the man who'd taken in the land heirs. Rumors of threats and warnings. Some feared the children. Others pitied them, but few dared to help. Rowe and his men scoured the hills, desperate to end what they called a nuisance. Their patrols grew bolder, their searches more ruthless. One afternoon, as the sun slipped behind a curtain of clouds, I heard the footsteps outside my cell grow heavy. A man arrived with a note from the sheriff, a warning and a promise. "You will tell us where the children are, or your family's fate will be the last thing they see." I folded the note and pressed it against my chest. I was their last hope, and I was running out of time. That night, as the cold settled deep, I whispered a vow to the darkness. "I will find you. I will bring you home." The wind answered with a low moan, and somewhere, beyond the walls in the silence, the land waited for the reckoning to come. They say the forest keeps secrets. That's not entirely true. The forest doesn't keep secrets, it swallows them, hides them under moss and bark, beneath roots thick as a man's arm. Sometimes, if you listen long enough, it whispers those secrets back, but only when it chooses. I know this because the forest has been both prison and refuge for us these last weeks. After they locked me away in that cell, after the judge gave his cold decree, something in me broke and rebuilt itself. I couldn't sit and rot while the girls were out there, exposed to the biting cold and the cruel eyes of men who'd rather see them vanish than safe. I had to find a way back to them. It was a quiet night when the jailer's footsteps faltered, too tired, too distracted. The lock on my cell was old, rusted in the freezing air. I found my chance in a careless turn of his back, the keys slipping from his belt. I caught them with numb fingers, heart hammering louder than the wind outside. Freedom tastes like iron and cold mud when you're too used to the staleness of stone walls. I moved through the town like a shadow, avoiding every gaze, every whisper. The streets were emptying for the night, the few brave souls tucked inside warm homes, safe from the bitter winter wind. I slipped past the sheriff's office, past the tavern where men drank to forget, and out into the wild. The forest greeted me like an old wound, sharp, raw, and full of memories I tried to bury. The moon hung low, a pale eye watching over the trees. I followed the narrow path we'd taken before, the trail marked only by broken branches and faint footprints pressed deep in the snow. The cold bit at my face, but I barely noticed. My mind raced with images the girls' faces etched in memory, the weight of their silence, the flicker of hope in their eyes when I'd promised we'd find a way. As I neared the mining shack, a faint glow caught my eye, flickering light that shouldn't have been there. I slowed, every muscle coiled, rifle raised but steady. A voice broke the stillness. "Cormac?" It was Sonny. The relief that hit me was so fierce I almost dropped my weapon. She stepped into the firelight, eyes wide but steady, clutching a bundle of dry kindling. "We thought you were dead," she said, voice cracking but strong. "I'm not," I said simply. "Not yet." We huddled by the fire inside the shack, the flames chasing shadows from the worn wood walls. The air smelled of pine smoke and something else, determination. They told me what had happened since I'd gone. The sheriff's men had scoured the hills but never found them. They had hidden deeper in the forest, moving only under the cover of darkness, learning to read the land, to listen to the whispers of the trees. Tahu showed me a crude map, drawn in charcoal on bark. It marked places of water, shelter, and danger. Mai, still clutching her wooden spoon, had grown quiet but watched me with those wide eyes that seemed to see too much. "You can't keep running," I said, my voice rough from disuse. Sonny nodded, eyes flickering to the shadows beyond the window. "We know, but going back means facing them. Chester Dunn won't stop until they're gone." The name cut sharper than any blade. Chester Dunn, the man who'd burned their mother's wagon, who'd tried to erase their existence so he could take their land. "I'll fight for you," I promised, my throat tightening. "Whatever it takes." For a long moment, no one spoke. Then Mai reached up, placing her small hand on mine, a quiet act of trust that felt heavier than any promise. The days that followed were a blur of preparation and planning. We gathered what little we could: dried herbs, stolen food from abandoned cabins, scraps of cloth to mend torn clothes. I fashioned traps from fallen branches, careful to avoid setting anything that could harm the girls. At night, we sat by the fire, talking without words. The silence between us filled with something that didn't need to be spoken: hope. But hope is a fragile thing in a world like this. One evening, as the sun bled red behind the trees, the crack of a rifle echoed through the valley. My heart seized. "Get down!" I hissed, pulling the girls behind a fallen log. The shots came again, closer this time, and I caught a glimpse of shapes moving through the trees, men with rifles, cold eyes, hunting us like animals. We ran, stumbling through underbrush, branches tearing at our clothes and skin. The forest seemed to close in around us, thick with shadows and fear. I held Mai close, whispering promises of safety, even as my mind screamed for a way out. We reached a small creek, water freezing over with the first ice of winter. I paused, knowing the men were closing in. There was a narrow path along the bank, jagged and slippery. "We have to cross," I said, voice low. Quiet and fast. One by one, we slipped over the ice-covered rocks, the cold biting into our bones. Behind us, the hunters emerged from the trees, voices harsh, orders sharp. The last thing I saw before plunging into the dark underbrush was Chester Dunn's cruel grin, the silver buckle on his belt catching the dying light like a wound. We ran until the forest opened onto a ridge overlooking the town. The wind whipped through the pines, carrying with it the scent of smoke and something else: danger. Sonny looked out toward the distant lights. "They'll come," she said, "but we'll be ready." I nodded, feeling the weight of every scar, every lost night. every promise made in the cold. We were not just running from ghosts. We were running towards something, a chance to reclaim what was stolen, to stand against the dark, and to find a home. That night, beneath a sky heavy with stars, I carved 3 small figures from pine, rough and unpainted. I handed them to the girls, one by one. They're not just toys, I told them. They're a reminder. No matter what comes, you're not alone. Sonny clutched hers tightly. Tahu smiled faintly, and Mai pressed hers to her cheek. I looked out into the night, feeling the cold settle deep. The war was far from over. But for the first time since the fire, I believed we might just survive it. The dawn rose slowly, dragging pale fingers of light through the tangled branches. I barely slept. My mind circled endlessly, like a hawk hunting for prey in the gray morning. Every sound felt like a warning, the crack of a twig, the distant call of a crow, even the subtle shift of snow beneath a small footstep. The girls were silent as we packed what little we had left. Sani moved with a quiet strength that belied her years. Tahu had grown sharper in her glances, and Mai still clung to the small carved figure, her wide eyes watching everything but saying nothing. We knew what was coming. Chester Dunn's reach was long. His men were better armed, crueler, and determined. But what he didn't understand was that we were not just survivors, we were fighters. I had spent the past weeks gathering what I could: small traps, makeshift weapons, and knowledge of the forest's secret paths. The forest itself had become our ally, hiding us from prying eyes and swallowing the sounds of our footsteps. But time was running thin. That morning, we set out toward the old mill, a ruined skeleton of a building on the edge of town. It was isolated, abandoned long ago, and surrounded by dense woods. It could be our fortress, our shield. The journey was hard. Snow crunched underfoot, the cold biting through layers of worn fabric. I kept the girls close, always watching the tree line, always alert. Halfway there, we spotted fresh tracks, heavy boots, too deliberate to be accidental. "They're close," I said without looking back. "We need to move faster." The girls nodded, faces pale but determined. The mill loomed like a ghost in the distance, its broken windows and sagging roof silhouetted against the fading sky. We hurried forward, my heart pounding like a drum in the silence. Inside, the air was thick with dust and cold. The floorboards creaked under our feet, and shadows danced like restless spirits. I found a corner near the old furnace that still held warmth and piled broken crates to barricade the door. The girls settled close, bodies huddled for warmth and safety. Days passed in a quiet rhythm. Watch, rest, prepare. We learned to read the forest signs, where the wind would carry sound, which paths were safest, and how to move without leaving a trace. We shared stories without words, comforted with small touches and steady presence. Sani began teaching the girls how to use the slingshot I'd made, how to aim and steady their breath. Tahu took to scouting the perimeter, her sharp eyes catching every movement. Mai remained quiet mostly, but sometimes, when the fire crackled low, she'd hum a soft tune that floated through the cold air like a fragile promise. But Chester Dunn's shadow was never far. One late afternoon, as the sun bled out behind the hills, a scout caught our trail. I saw him first, a lanky man, dressed in dark leather, creeping through the underbrush with practiced stealth. He paused, scanning the tree line, then disappeared into the forest. "Idit hesitate. We need to move." "Now," I whispered. The girls gathered their things quickly. We slipped through a hidden door in the mill's cellar, a forgotten passage leading beneath the old building and into the thick woods beyond. The passage was narrow and damp, the smell of earth and rot heavy in the air. I led the way, the light of my flickering lantern casting eerie shadows on the rough walls. We emerged into the forest on the other side, where the trees grew close and the snow muffled our footsteps. But our escape had been noticed. The next days were a blur of running, hiding, and surviving. We moved under cover of darkness, slipping through the forest's secret veins like ghosts. The girls grew stronger, their fear tempered by resolve. Sani's eyes shone fierce with determination. "We'll take back what's ours," she said one night, voice low but steady. I believed her, but Chester Dunn's men were relentless. One morning, as the first light crept through the trees, we found a trap crude but deadly, set to catch the unwary. Tahu's sharp eyes spotted it just in time. We dismantled it carefully, my hands steady despite the tension. That was close, I said, swallowing the fear that rose in my throat. The girls didn't flinch. We found refuge in a small cave deep in the woods, a secret place carved by time and water. The air was cold, but sheltering. Inside, we laid our few belongings and kindled a fire. The girls gathered around, faces glowing in the flickering light. For the first time in weeks, the silence felt safe. But safety was an illusion. One night, the sound of horses shattered the stillness. I peered out through a narrow crevice and saw them, men with torches, their faces twisted with greed and malice. They were closing in. I woke the girls, urgency sharp in my voice. We have to run, I said. The forest was alive with shadows and whispers. We slipped through the trees, hearts pounding, breaths sharp in the cold air. Branches tore at our clothes, snow muffled our footsteps, but the hunters were relentless. We reached a narrow ravine, the only place where the trees thinned enough to cross. The horses couldn't follow. I helped the girls down the steep slope, one by one. Behind us, the men shouted, curses spilling into the night. We hid in the thick underbrush, trembling but alive. The dawn broke cold and gray. In the quiet that followed, I held the girls close, feeling the weight of everything we had lost and everything we still had to fight for. We won't give up, I whispered. Mai looked up, eyes shining with a fragile hope. We will be free, she said softly. And for the first time, I believed her. The fight for justice was far from over, but the forest was no longer just a hiding place. It was our home. The forest had become both our sanctuary and our prison. The bitter cold outside seemed less harsh than the weight of what was coming. Every day felt like a countdown, a breath held too long, waiting for the storm to break. The girls, once silent shadows hiding in my coat, had started to shift. Their eyes held flickers of something I hadn't seen before, a spark of hope, of defiance. But that spark was fragile, easily smothered beneath the crushing weight of fear and loss. The days blurred together in a relentless march. We scavenged what we could from the forest floor, pooling the small scraps of food we had. The rationing was strict. There was never enough. I watched the girls carefully, noting the way Sani's jaw clenched as hunger gnawed at her. The way Mai's tiny fingers trembled when she thought no one was watching. Still, none of them complained. Their silence was a quiet rebellion, an unspoken pact between us to hold on. One evening, as the sun bled out across the horizon, I heard a faint noise, distant and almost imperceptible, the soft crunch of footsteps through snow. I froze, heart hammering against my ribs. The girls looked up, their faces pale. Someone's coming, I whispered. They nodded but didn't ask questions. We extinguished the fire and melted into the shadows. It was Marowina. She emerged from the trees like a ghost, her face weathered, her eyes sharp as ever. I heard, she said simply. You're still out here. I nodded. We had to move. Chester's men won't stop. She studied us for a long moment. You can't keep running forever. No, I said. But I can protect them. Marowina sighed, then reached into her cloak and pulled out a small bundle of letters. These came for you. I took the letters carefully, unfolding the fragile paper. They were from the townsfolk, messages of cautious support and quiet defiance. A few brave souls had started to question Chester Dunn's grip on the town, his ruthless attempts to seize land and silence anyone who opposed him. One letter was from Sheriff Malden himself, though its tone was guarded. He promised an investigation, but I knew how slow and corrupt justice could be. Marowina's gaze hardened. You'll need allies. I don't have many, I said. You have more than you think, she replied. That night, we planned. The mill was too exposed, the cave too hidden to be useful in the long term. We needed a place, a real refuge, somewhere we could gather strength and build something new. Marowina spoke of a forgotten homestead deep in the hills. a place once owned by a family who had long since vanished. Empty but sturdy, she said, and far enough from town that Chester's men won't come easily. It was a gamble, but it was our best chance. At first light, we set out, the girls' faces pale but determined, bundled in threadbare coats and hope. The journey was harder than before, the snow deeper, the cold sharper. My legs ached, but I kept moving, pulling the wagon with what little strength I had left. When we arrived, the homestead rose from the snow like a relic of a forgotten time. Its windows were shattered, its roof sagging, but it had walls and shelter. We worked through the day, clearing snow, patching broken boards, and lighting a fire that roared with fierce promise. That night, as the girls slept huddled together, I sat by the fire and felt something I hadn't in months, a flicker of hope. We were still here. We were still fighting. But the storm was gathering. Days passed, and slowly, word spread. A handful of townsfolk came, strangers at first, then familiar faces. They brought food, tools, and stories of their own battles against Chester Dunn's cruelty. Marawina worked tirelessly, organizing what little support we had. We were becoming a quiet resistance, a flicker of light in the gathering dark. One evening, as I sharpened a broken blade, Sani approached me. "We need to talk," she said, voice low but fierce. I nodded. She pulled me aside and told me what she'd learned, whispers of Chester's next move. Plans to bring in more men, to strike hard and fast. "They want to end this," she said, "once and for all." I looked into her eyes, so much fire, so much pain. "We'll be ready," I said. But I couldn't shake the weight settling in my chest. The following night, the sky roared with thunder, rain lashing against the broken windows of the homestead. We gathered inside, the fire crackling as the storm raged outside. Mai clutched my hand tightly, her small face pale in the flickering light. "I'm scared," she whispered. I squeezed her hand gently. "Me too." That night I lay awake, listening to the wind howl like a living thing. The fight ahead would be the hardest yet. But for the first time, I wasn't alone. We were a family, ragged, broken, but unyielding. And we would stand together. As the dawn broke, I looked out over the hills. The world was still beautiful, cold and harsh, but alive. And so were we. The cold had seeped into my bones, but it was nothing compared to the weight settling in my chest. The nights had grown longer, darker, and the silence thicker, the kind that presses down on you, filling every crack and crevice until it feels like it might suffocate you whole. We had built our fragile fortress on a promise, on hope, and on trust that still felt too new to hold. The homestead, though battered and worn, had become a sanctuary for the girls. June, Bess, and Mai, each of them carrying shadows far deeper than their years, had started to look like children again. Not just ghosts in a frozen winter. But I knew, as sure as the biting wind outside, that the storm Chester Dunn had promised was coming for us. The nights before the attack, I could hear the girls whispering amongst themselves, their voices a careful mix of fear and courage. I didn't join them. Sometimes I think I wanted to hold on to my own silence, maybe because I wasn't ready to admit how close the edge really was. I sat by the fire, the flickering flames throwing sharp shadows across the walls, and I thought about my wife, about the life we had lost, and about what I had promised myself, to protect these girls, no matter the cost. The knock came in the dead of night. Hard, urgent, relentless. Not a polite request, a hammering that shook the walls of our fragile refuge. I grabbed the rifle, heart thundering in my chest. The girls stirred behind me, their breaths shallow and quick. I opened the door just enough to see the dark shapes waiting in the snow. It was Chester Dunn, and he wasn't alone. 15 men, black coats pressed tight against the cold, faces hidden under hats pulled low. Their eyes glittered like steel. Chester stepped forward, that crooked smile twisting his face into something cruel and hard. "You've been a thorn in my side for too long, Belle," he said, voice like gravel. "Time to end this." I didn't say a word. I stepped outside, the rifle steady in my hands, and met his gaze. "I'm not giving you those girls," I said. He laughed, low and bitter. "You think this is your fight? You're just a man who lost everything. They're mine by law, by right, and I'll take what's mine." The men moved forward like wolves, slow and deliberate. I knew then this wouldn't be a battle of words. It was about to be a fight for everything we held dear. The first shot shattered the night. Chaos exploded around us, voices shouting, wood splintering, the acrid smell of smoke rising. I fired again, heart pounding, every muscle screaming to protect what was left of my broken family. Inside, June grabbed Bess and Mai, pulling them to the back room, locking the door. Their eyes wide, brimming with tears, but also a fierce fire that made me proud beyond words. They weren't just scared children anymore. They were survivors. Outside, the fight raged on. Man against one-man odds stacked impossibly against me. But I fought with everything I had. Every ounce of strength born from loss and love and desperation. Shots rang out, and I could hear the girls scream through the night, not cries of fear, but of defiance. Suddenly, I felt a sharp pain in my side, burning fire spreading through my ribs. I stumbled but caught myself, gritting my teeth. I wouldn't fall. Not now. Then, just as the dawn began to paint the sky with cold light, a horn blew in the distance. Voices called out. Men on horseback thundered through the trees. Sheriff Malden and a small group of townsfolk, armed and angry, their faces hard but their eyes full of resolve. Chester's men froze. The weight of the law or something like it pressed down on them. They began to retreat, dragging their wounded, leaving behind the bitter scent of smoke and fear. I fell to my knees, blood warm and sticky on the snow. The girls rushed out, their faces pale but alive. June threw her arms around me, tears falling freely now. "We're safe," she whispered. I nodded, swallowing the pain. For now. Sheriff Malden came forward, eyes sharp but softer than before. "This ends today, Dunn," he said, voice steady. "No more hiding behind threats and lies." Chester spat in the snow and vanished into the shadows, but I knew it wasn't over. The town began to change after that night. People who had once looked away now dared to stand with us. The girls' names became known not as whispers, but as stories of courage. June, Bess, and Mai, no longer just survivors of a dark past, were becoming beacons of hope. As I watched them one evening, playing by the fire, laughter lightening the cold air, I finally felt something I hadn't in a long time. Peace. I still carried my losses, still bore the scars, but here, in the warmth of their smiles, I found something new. Not just survival, but a future. The fight for justice was far from over, but we had won the hardest battle. The battle to be seen, to be heard, to be free. And that made all the difference. The winter had passed, though its chill still lingered in the corners of the cabin and in the memories we all carried. The snow melted away slowly, revealing the earth beneath cracked, scarred, but still stubbornly alive. I stood at the edge of the land, the cold air crisp in my lungs, watching the first rays of sunlight stretch across the hills. The sky was a wash of pale gold and soft pink, the kind of dawn that feels like a promise. The girls were inside, busy as always. June was tending to the small garden we'd managed to coax into life near the porch, her hands steady despite their delicate age. Bess was stacking firewood careful, methodical, and Mai, the youngest, was chasing after a stray chicken, her laughter ringing out like a bell. I hadn't seen smiles like those in a long time, not since before my wife had gone. That morning, something inside me shifted. Not just because the land was waking up, but because we were. The past had clawed at us with sharp fingers, threats, silence, betrayal, but it had also taught us something vital. We were not broken, not beyond repair. I thought about Chester Dunn, the men who had tried to take everything from us, and the town that had once turned its back. I thought about the nights spent staring at the fire, wondering if hope was just a cruel joke. But now, as I watched my daughters, my family, I realized that hope wasn't a thing you find or lose. It's something you build, something you protect with every ounce of your being. The deed was safe, held tightly in my coat pocket, a symbol not just of land, but of justice long denied. The court had ruled in our favor, recognizing the rightful ownership of those 3 girls who had once been silenced and forgotten. But the real victory was more than paper and law. It was in the quiet moments, the way June braided Bess's hair, the way Mai clung to my side without fear. It was in the trust we had forged from nothing but silence and time. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the sky with fire, June came to me. Her eyes held a wisdom beyond her years. "I want to learn," she said softly, "about everything." And in that simple sentence, I saw the future bright, uncertain, and ours to claim. We started rebuilding more than just a home. We rebuilt a life. The town began to change too. Neighbors who had once kept their distance now brought baskets of food and firewood. The sheriff stopped by regularly, no longer just a man of law, but a friend. There was a sense of belonging that had seemed impossible before. A community that chose to stand with us, not against. But the fight wasn't over, and I knew it never truly would be. There would always be shadows trying to creep back in, people who wanted to rewrite our story. Yet we had learned to stand firm, to speak even when our voices trembled, to protect what mattered, not with anger, but with unwavering love. The cabin no longer felt like a refuge from the world. It was a beacon, a testament to resilience. One night, as the fire crackled and the girls slept, I sat alone on the porch. The wind was gentle, carrying with it the scent of pine and promise. I thought about the man I was before, the man I had become, the man I still wanted to be. Loss had shaped me, but it had not defined me. I was no longer just a man haunted by the past. I was a guardian of a future where 3 girls could grow without fear, where they could own their names, their land, and their stories. I looked up at the stars, scattered like diamonds across the night sky. For the first time in years, they didn't feel distant or cold. They felt like a map, a guide, a reminder that even in the darkest nights, there is light. And so, I stayed there for a long time, breathing in the quiet strength of the night, holding on to the fragile, fierce hope we had found. Because sometimes, the greatest act of courage is simply to keep going, to keep loving, to keep believing. And that, more than anything else, is how you start again. If you were in his shoes, would you fight the same battle? Share your thoughts with us down in the comments. Don't forget to like the video and explore the other stories waiting for you on the screen.